Professor Ian Plimer has just arrived. Sir, how are you?
I'm struggling through life with the greatest of ease.
Yeah, you haven't been well.
No, but that happens at times. Things don't go right.
Yeah.
Come in and get a grease and oil change and you're right again.
A valve grind and a decoke and away you go.
That's exactly right.
Well, bless you, bless you, bless you. This new policy that the Liberal Party's come up with with regard to nuclear power, what do you think of that?
Well, I don't dare use words that Sir Humphrey Appleby would use, but I think we finally have an opposition.
Yeah.
Instead of having the same policies, just slightly different, we have a real choice to make. And that is, do we want to have Australia with long-term energy, which is reliable, or do we want to be dependent upon the weather and sunbeams and sea breezes? And we see that in Eastern Australia at present. We have a crisis. It's cold. We are not generating electricity we need. We don't have enough gas to generate that electricity. We're in serious trouble.
You know,
they have to do something, and I think he was very clever. Mr. Dutton was very clever in floating the idea and starting the discussion. I think it took the Labor Party and the Greens by absolute surprise. And where do they go? They can either continue down the path of giving us unreliable, expensive energy, or they can do, as other advanced countries have done, is go nuclear. Now, the number of reactors that Dutton is talking about is the same that Slovakia, Slovenia and Spain have. They're advanced countries. There's nothing special that we're doing. It's really got to the stage now where we have the other side shrieking and not providing any sensible arguments. And if you want to have a green country, you go nuclear. So what are the Greens doing? The Greens are basically trying to stop us have electricity.
Yeah, it's almost sort of Pol Pot style, just going back to scorched earth or some sort of peasant economy. I don't know what they're thinking of.
I welcome it. I think he's opened up a huge discussion. I think it was the timing was right. I think the population is changing in its opinions. I think the 7 sites chosen are very sensible. That is where we already have the poles and wires. That is already where there are plans to decommission existing coal-fired power stations. And instead of having a coal-fired power station, you plonk a nuclear station there. The detailed discussion of the costs and these things has to come later, because there are ways of lowering costs. You can have one design for those 7 reactors. That's going to lower your costs. You can have a design of a recently built reactor, such as those in Finland or Sweden, and that will lower your costs. You could have modular reactors with some of the smaller coal-fired power stations like in Collie in Western Australia. That would be the ideal site for modular reactors. And these are being manufactured. The city of Hamilton in Ontario is a nuclear city. They have these small reactors. They have also big reactors. Most of Ontario's power is nuclear, whereas to the east we have hydropower in Quebec, and to the west we have coal-fired power. So we should be doing exactly that, is having a blend of power sources, because we have had times of drought when there's been not enough cooling water for the coal-fired power stations. We've had times of drought when there's not enough water for hydro power stations in wet Tasmania. So we need a diversity of sources, but you cannot keep an industrial economy running on sea breezes and sunbeams. No country does it, and we're not that smart.
I suppose the point at which they are vulnerable is this business about waste. What are we going to do with the waste? Has anybody in the world... I remember back in the 60s they used to talk about this thing called synrock, where they would get the waste, radioactive waste, and they would somehow fuse it into a storable commodity.
Well, synrock was invented by Ted Ringwood at the ANU in Canberra, and those were the times when universities actually were doing real science and real engineering.
It would be back in the 60s, wouldn't it?
It was in the 60s, yes. Yeah. And basically what Ringwood did was he looked at natural radioactive minerals. and really old minerals, so there was a lot of waste product in there for natural decay, and saying, well, these minerals have held these waste products for billions of years. Why don't we synthesise them? And we can put our waste into these. Now, most of the waste at present is stored in glass, and that technology dominates. It's not the best technology. Synrock is by far the best technology. But once you have a market that's captured, it's very hard to break into it. But we now have fast breeder reactors, and this is where you can put the spent fuel, which is, I think, erroneously called waste. You can put the spent fuel into these fast breeder reactors and use it to generate electricity. And so your amount of waste continues to diminish over your life. Now, the amount of waste that you would produce in your whole life, and presumably will go on 10 years, the amount of waste that you would produce for the electricity that you use, and you're a very big user of electricity compared with the average punter, would fill half a Coke can. That is the amount of waste that you would, as an individual, produce.
In your entire life?
In your entire life. Now,
Good
the
God.
volume of waste is not high. You can store that to use in fast breeder reactors. So I just wonder whether further down the track, Dutton might think of having a fast breeder reactor to burn up all the waste, because at present we have low-level nuclear waste spread right across every city.
Yeah.
It's from hospitals, it's from universities, it's from CSIRO, it's from research institutes. It's spread everywhere.
Yeah.
We have the high-level waste stored at Lucas Heights, and we are going to be producing more waste when we have our nuclear submarines. And Dutton is quite correct. You cannot have a nuclear submarine industry without a nuclear industry. Now, we already have a fledgling nuclear industry, and we've had that for nearly, more than 60 years now. And this is at Lucas Heights. We're onto our second reactor. It's a small 20-megawatt soft neutron reactor. I've used it a lot for research work. I've used reactors elsewhere in the world for research work. We have people who know about nuclear energy in this country already. So the arguments that we don't have the people, we don't have the skills is rubbish. And to put a reactor, say, in the Hunter Valley, we need skilled workers in a coal-fired power station, and the same sort of skills we need in a nuclear reactor. We need people who can work metal. We need people who can handle electrical equipment. We need people who can do heavy lifting. So I think it's an inspired move. I think it's not without time. We should have been nuclear in the 60s, but we have now bypassed all the older technologies, and the modern technologies are just superb and efficient.
And Professor, pardon me interrupting, there's obviously a synergy between submarines and baseload nuclear, and for the government to be saying and criticising Dutton for a nuclear plan when they're accepting a nuclear submarine program seems to be quite absurd, to say the least.
Well, they were caught napping. The government has no idea about energy policy, and they're squawking about everything. And what we see is the life of a wind turbine, they say is 25 years. Well, that's adding 10 years to its life. It's really about 15 years. And the life of a nuclear power station is at least 60, maybe 80 or 90 years. So you can amortise that investment over a long period of time. And the initial capital cost is high, but what spins off from that are a whole lot of other industries, and we now don't manufacture anything in this country. We cannot manufacture it because our energy costs are too high. If you want to have a foundry, you use a lot of energy. It's cheaper to build that foundry in Thailand or Malaysia than it is in Australia. And so we're exporting a lot of jobs simply because we don't have reliable, cheap energy.
Yes, I worry that we can't come to an agreement with the states or industry or even suburbia as to what we do with the low-level waste. If we can't agree on how we're going to dispose of that or store it, what hope do we have of doing something bigger, more threatening, more alarming?
I think we don't have an agreement because of hysteria, because of ignorance.
Yeah.
And
fear.
The media likes its sensational stories, and it's a beat-up, but there's some if you want to hang on to waste, there's some obvious places to do it. We have a deep mine in South Australia at Radium Hill. It was a uranium mine. It operated from, I think, about 1916 to the 1960s. Where's the best place to put radioactive waste? It's in a uranium mine. This is a deep mine. It's isolated. It's on one station. It's miles from anywhere. There's the main Commonwealth Railway line is close by. The Barrier Highway is close by. The nearest town has 3 people.
It would be geologically stable?
Oh, well, it's only been geologically stable for 2 billion years.
Oh,
yes.
well, that should be fairly comforting.
I can't see that next Tuesday it's going to erupt into a volcano.
No. I remember Bob Hawke. I can't remember exactly what the circumstance was, but he floated the idea that Australia should open up a repository for the world. And we sell, and we could make billions and billions of dollars out of taking the waste from other countries who have a similar sort of public relations problem. And we could store it at a cost and to our benefit. And it's a big country. There's a lot of space out there.
Those ideas have been floating around since the...
but he's an old-fashioned Labor guy who seriously suggested this.
He would be turning in his grave looking at the worst Labor government we've ever had in my voting life, and I started voting in 1966. He would be turning in his grave. This is not a Labor government. They are putting working people out of jobs. They are putting massive economic stress on working people. It is an ideological socialist government. It has nothing to do with the working man.
No.
It's basically the ALP is the political wing of the unions. And there's a bit of division now in the unions. The unions can see that there's a lot of work to be generated in a nuclear industry. The unions can see that those displaced out of the coal industry will have jobs in the nuclear industry. They can see that there are construction jobs. So there are hints of division appearing already.
So we could... How much money do you think we could make offering this service to the rest of the world?
Oh, we could make billions. The main European countries generating power by nuclear means are highly populated countries.
Yeah.
They're not as geologically stable as Australia. They would snap it up straight away. Countries like South Korea and Taiwan would snap it up simply because, for security reasons, it's better to have the spent fuel elsewhere than it is in their own country. So I can see that Japan would be straight in there. They don't particularly want to have, in a highly populated small island nation, they don't want to have spent fuel there. They want to put it somewhere else. Yeah. So I think it's eminently sensible. We can make money by mining the uranium, creating yellow cake. From that, we should be making fuel rods. We should be leasing out those fuel rods to the world. We should be taking the spent fuel back at a cost and reprocessing it or storing it and reprocessing into new rods. So there's a cradle-to-grave industry there. It's waiting for Australia, and this would set us up as, in effect, being the Saudi Arabia of nuclear energy.
Yeah, I mean, for South Australia, it would be a very natural thing to do, wouldn't it?
It's a perfect place for it, and I also think it's politically better off than, say, Victoria or New South Wales or Queensland for the waste. That South Australia has made some political decisions regarding uranium, and it's interesting that probably the driving force would be, I think, in South Australia, a Labor government, not a Conservative government. Conservatives here are pretty weak, but the Labor government does make those sort of decisions. I noticed the Premier didn't wholeheartedly disagree with this concept, whereas ideological Victoria, who sent themselves bankrupt, they're talking about the cost of the nuclear industry is $100 billion. Well, Victoria's got this underground rail system they want to put in for $200 billion, going from nowhere to nowhere. So who are they to criticise the costs?
Yeah.
Actually, they're suggesting that the nuclear industry can only cost $50 billion on latest data, and that Bowen's energy plant could cost 500 billion. So there's a lot of room to.
With Bowen's plans, we've got to put in new poles and wires right across the countryside. We've got to take out prime agricultural land for solar panels. We've got to destroy pristine rainforests and prime land with wind turbines. We've got to destroy our scenic coastline with wind turbines. The cost of that is absolutely monumental, whereas what Dutton is suggesting is we already have the poles and wires. Where we had a power station, we put another one.
Yes.
And instead of rebuilding a coal-fired power station, which I think we should do anyway, we put in nuclear. So I think it's a compromise to keep the lights on.
Well, we saw with the referendum that people were sensible. People did vote after making a considered decision. Mm-hmm. So I guess optimistically we might assume that people, when confronted with the nuclear option, would embrace it.
I think that will happen because with the referendum, Albo didn't read the room.
No.
He hasn't read the room with inflation. He hasn't read the room with interest rates. He hasn't read the room with losing his traditional base, and they are the workers. I mean, their primary vote is something which is frightening. It's frighteningly low.
Yeah.
And they are going to depend upon the communists, the Greens, or the watermelons, green on the outside, red inside. Yeah. They're going to be dependent upon the Greens to continue destroying this country. So Albo hasn't read the room on energy. And he's actually being wrong-footed on this, completely by Dutton, and this came as a complete surprise. And this is why there's such a hysterical outburst. Now, I think it's fabulous. I think Bowen is the best thing the Liberal Party have got in Parliament. And he keeps,
God's gift.
Yeah, he's the Mr. Bean of politics. He's just fabulous.
Yeah, I think you're right. But we got to maybe go to the cause of a lot of our trouble. I was talking to Bella de Brera, Dr. Bella de Brera.
I know Bella, yes. She's a wonderful woman.
I stumbled across her and I'm absolutely enchanted with her.
Well, she's highly intelligent, incredibly articulate.
Yes.
And she does her homework. She, in the IPA, looks at our education system, and what Bella comes up with is just frightening.
Well, this is what she was talking to me, or to us this morning, about the fact that they want to take our kids as young as 3, and they want to start the indoctrination earlier than they are at the moment. Mm-hmm. And that is really what it is. It's a radical grab bag of everything that a parent would be terrified to hear a child being indoctrinated with. Yes. Not educated.
Yeah, well,
early learning, it's not early learning.
No, it's early propaganda. It's doing exactly what the communists did in the Soviet Union. It's get the kid early, turn the kids against their family. East Germany was absolutely magnificent at doing this, is turning the kids against the family. The kids would dobbing their parents would go to jail, and the kid had done his duty by the state, and then, of course, was abandoned, became, in effect, a ward of the communist state.
So these places of learning, universities, are turning out ideologues, not teachers, but they're people with an agenda. But there has to be a Mr. Big or somebody in the background who's the architect of all of this nonsense. It couldn't have just started and evolved, could it?
I think it has. I think it started in the 60s with the student demonstrations in Paris in 1968, and I think it's just evolved. And we're now in the generation of people who are post-war, very wealthy people who have not had to go to war, not had to struggle, and they're devoting their energies to creating nirvana. And they haven't travelled enough. They haven't travelled in communist countries. For example, in 1977, took me a long while to organise this, but I bought a combi van in Frankfurt with my wife and kids, and we drove through Czechoslovakia, Poland, East Germany, Soviet Union, and came out 3 months later in Finland, where it was a pleasure to see other colours besides red and grey, dismal grey. And I wanted to look at communism firsthand. And it was absolutely frightening. And what I noticed was people would never look you in the eye. They were frightened to do that. And sometimes late at night you get a tap on the side of the combi van and someone wanted to come and talk to you. And then immediately after that, I went to the Shah's Iran. And it was a very, very similar system with Savak, the security police there. I know my lectures might be incendiary, but I gave some lectures at Ferdowsi University in Mashhad in the far east of Iran, and I noticed there were Savak police there. They weren't taking notes, they weren't listening, but they were making sure that I didn't say the Shah's a pig or anything like that. So for me, it was a fabulous political education to actually guide myself through Eastern Europe. And I think the only reason I got permission to do that from the communists was that they thought, well, we might be able to snare this one. And I know driving through the Soviet Union, you'd go through a checkpoint, and when you'd leave it, a gentleman would pick up the phone and let the next checkpoint know. And I was not allowed to deviate off certain roads. Eventually I did, and I went to some of the villages. These were the villages which are no different from Tolstoy's time. And I got into a lot of trouble for deviating off the course that was given to me.
But what were they worried that you would see?
Well, I'm trained as an observer. That's what we do as a geologist. And I'm also a scientist, so I'm curious. And I wanted to observe and fulfil my curiosity by going off the beaten track. And but it wasn't necessary. I mean, you'd line up for hours at one shop to get some milk. Now, that shop would sell milk and fish hooks. And then you'd line up again at another shop to get some eggs. And you'd line up for hours, and you could buy eggs and concrete bricks in that shop. And then you'd line up again. As for meat, well, I could get meat because I did exchange a bit of money on the black market, which was a rather dangerous thing to do with a wife and a couple of kids. But and we had to spend the money because they count your money going in, they count it going out. So we had to live like kings on Georgian wine and venison, etc. So, and again, those were in the expensive hotels, and you didn't have to queue for those. And you noticed in some parts, I went to the Morza glass factory in what was then Czechoslovakia. And we came in, we had German customs plates on the combi van. And we went in there and we were shepherded into a special area. And this was the hard currency area of the Morza glass factory where you could buy material using Deutsche Mark. And they loved it. And then there was another area for the communists, and that was full of East German tourists who were sold trinkets and things which were totally worthless. And so it was eminently evident straight away that it was a system which was unfair.
Yeah. But understandably, there was ultimately a rebellion. People had had enough, threw it off. I don't know what they've got at the moment that's any better, but, you know.
Well, that gets into a long discussion about the Russian psyche, you know, how depression is a wonderful way to enjoy life.
You reckon it's in the genes?
I think it's in the genes. Read Russian literature, read Turgenev or read Tolstoy. I mean, it's in the genes and it's there. And suffering is part of what it is to be Russian, as is drinking bucket loads of vodka.
Yeah, well, they've got to do something, I suppose. So it's not so much the cost of things in the Soviet Union, or
it's the availability.
It's the availability.
Yeah, you just can't get stuff.
Yeah. And
there might be a rush on butter, and when the queue hears that, then it gets a bit edgy. And it was interesting. You'd pull up for fuel somewhere, and someone would come out and they'd fuel you up. Those were the days of service stations where you actually did get service, and. Someone would be cleaning your windscreen and would lean in and ask if you've got any money to, I can change money. And I remember in Poland, it was in Krakow, and there was a really daggy, dirty-looking bloke who cleaned my windscreen. And so I did change some Deutsche Mark with him for Polish zlotys. And then a little bit later... in the same area, I stopped and a gentleman came up to me and said, "I saw you change some money." I thought, "Oh, shit, here we go." Anyway, to my great relief, he says, "I can do it at a better rate." And after that, I was very tempered in my money changing.
The human spirit, though. I mean,
Yeah, the system was completely corrupt. People were poor. Yeah. And give a man his beer, his football, and a mindless job, and you've got them controlled.
Yeah.
And that's what it was.
And cheap ciggies.
Oh, cheap fags, yes. And things that, you'd kill a smokestack smoking, those sort of things. It's just terrible.
It's wonderful to see you, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for coming. Professor Ian Plimer, ladies and gentlemen.